All right, it looks like we have a really good number of people logged in, so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. And thank you for joining. We're glad to share this overview of a new data sharing agreement. It's the multi-jurisdictional vaccine provider and jurisdiction data exchange agreement, which we are also calling the PJA. So some jurisdictions have already signed the PJA, including the Veterans Health Administration and 3 jurisdiction IISs. So it's a really exciting step forward for the IZ Gateway, and it's supporting legal framework to enable data exchange with multi-jurisdictional vaccine provider organizations. And we are so glad that you've joined to help us keep the momentum going. So the purpose of today's webinar is to provide an overview of this new agreement, the PJA, and hopefully provide you with all of the information that you need to support the execution of the agreement, which is needed to exchange data with the Department of Veterans Affairs and other multi-jurisdictional providers. And to accomplish that purpose, we will start by doing an IZ Gateway overview and reviewing the IZ Gateway use cases. We'll talk through security considerations and jurisdiction controls, talk about the IZ Gateway legal framework, and then we'll do a deep dive into the PJA, ending with time for questions and answers, and then providing some possible next steps. If you have any questions along the way, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A box, or you may unmute yourself and ask your question during the call. Our speakers for today are Lindsey Lowinski, Health IT Policy Manager for the IZ Gateway team, and Chris Alibrandi, who is a senior attorney at the Network for Public Health Law, which provides technical assistance to the IZ Gateway project. And so with that, I will hand it over to Lindsey Lowinski for the IZ Gateway overview.
Thanks, Michelle. All right, let's get into it. Next slide, please. So introducing the IZ Gateway. It is a cloud-based message routing service for immunization data exchange. It offers a consolidated integration hub for data exchange with standard onboarding and testing procedures. And then most importantly for this group, it offers a standardized policy infrastructure for data exchange between IIS and multi-jurisdictional vaccine providers. Next slide. So what the Gateway does and does not do, as mentioned earlier, it is a message router, and it enables more complete patient immunization histories for IIS providers and consumers. Probably more importantly, what it does not do is store data, act as a message repository, or send data to CDC repositories. Next slide. All right, so we'll get into some of the use cases. There are 3. So starting with the first and most importantly for today's discussion is data exchange with vaccine providers. And that can be federal agencies or multi-jurisdictional providers in the more general sense. And that can be long-term care facilities or skilled nursing facilities, et cetera. Next. And then data exchange with other IIS. And then finally, data exchange with consumers via patient applications or portals. Next. All right, so back to use case 1, so data exchange with multi-jurisdictional vaccine providers. This data flow diagram depicts data exchange among those parties. So starting on the left side, you see the multi-jurisdictional providers. In the center there, in the green image, you see the IZ Gateway. And then to the right, the globes are the IIS, which is the final destination. So the IZ Gateway software is hosted by the Association for Public Health Laboratories, or APHL, on behalf of the CDC. Another item to note is you'll notice that the arrows are double-sided. This is because the information does flow both ways. VXUs are sent, so vaccine reporting messages are sent and then acknowledges are sent back. And then you also have queries or QBPs, and the same there. There's a related response for that. If you notice on the right-hand side, the diagram depicts existing data exchange relationships with IIS, and it's just important to note the gateway doesn't aim to replace those existing functional relationships, just enhancing the data exchange. Next slide. So again, use case one, data exchange with vaccine providers. So again, mentioning there are VXUs and QBPs that are sent and requested. But what I want to highlight on this slide is really bullets 2 and 3 on the right-hand side, and that's the legal agreements. So the baseline agreement is the APHL DUA, and all jurisdictions must sign that in order to participate and exchange data over the IZ Gateway. The majority of jurisdictions have signed this. And then the third bullet here is the PJA, or multi-jurisdictional vaccine provider to IIS data exchange agreement. This agreement went out on January 14th. So just ensure you did receive that. And if not, feel free to reach out to us or the IZ Gateway at cdc.gov email. Next slide. So this slide and the next one, I'm just going to briefly highlight the policy requirements for the other 2 use cases. For data exchange with IIS, or among and between IIS, there is the interjurisdictional MOU that must be signed along with the share task order in the data use agreement already mentioned. Next slide. And then for the third use case, exchange with consumers, or data to consumers, I should say, is the consumer access task order in that APHL DUA. Next slide. I guess I'll just quickly ask, are there any questions thus far? All right. We'll get into some of the security controls then. So the key takeaway from this slide is just having the understanding that IIS have control and how they interact with their data exchange partners through the gateway. And that just means that IIS have full control. They choose the use cases in which they participate in. They choose which partners they would like to exchange with. And this happens technically as well. So not only do you select them, but you have to go through a process of actually setting them up in your systems and then testing the data to ensure it meets your data quality standards. Next slide. And then security controls to protect data. So data is always encrypted while in transit. Neither APHL nor the IZ Gateway collect or maintain PII. And then finally, it conforms to the policy framework and security standards included in the agreements that are signed by all data exchange partners. Next slide. All right, I will pass it off to Chris to outline the legal framework.
Okay, thank you, Lindsey. So as mentioned, the Network for Public Health Law was brought in to evaluate all the data sharing that was going on here in order to support creating and drafting the legal agreements needed that the various parties would need to see to feel comfortable sharing it. And today is the third of the 3 various agreements that we have helped develop, and you likely are already signatories to 1 or 2 of the other agreements. So today we're going to be talking about as has already been referenced, the multi-jurisdiction vaccine provider organization to IIS agreement, or we've nicknamed it the PJA. So go ahead, next slide. So in the center of the legal framework is the IZ Gateway itself. And that is a platform hosted by the Association of Public Health Laboratories, which you're likely familiar has been longstanding in its provision of data services. Now go ahead, next slide. And what shows here are the different parties to the 3 different agreements we've been talking about, but we will be focusing on one particular one today. So on the right, those 3 vertical blue orbs represent different jurisdictions, whether they're states or territories. Each of those are the IISs, the immunization information systems of the particular jurisdictions. And on the left are these, what we have referred to as multi-jurisdiction vaccine provider organizations. Many of them are federal agencies like the Veterans Health Administration, the Department of Defense, Federal Bureau of Prisons, but also you'll see the circle below that is what are sometimes seen as non-traditional vaccinators, whether they're the skilled nursing facilities or long-term care facilities. So next slide. This now presents all of the legal agreements that we that are part of this whole framework. So over on, well, on the bottom, the APHL DUA, the data use agreement. And if Michelle, you want to circle that to draw their attention to the bottom. So that data use agreement is really, as we say, it's the baseline for sharing the data. That's the agreement that the IISs on the right enter into with the American Public Health Laboratories in order to be able to have their data shared through IZ Gateway. Further to the right, the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, those are the agreements, the interjurisdictional MOU for those IISs to be able to exchange data with each other or one another. The agreements to the left, so the federal agencies that are these multi-jurisdiction provider organizations, the federal agencies actually have memoranda of agreement with the CDC because the CDC is sponsoring the gateway. So the federal agencies have that agreement with them in order to access or share past data through the IZ Gateway. But the non-traditional vaccinators, whether it's the a SNF or long-term care, since they are not those federal agencies, and for HIPAA purposes, they effectively are sharing data with covered entities, meaning the IIS is on the right. For their participation, they're signing business associate agreements with the gateway in order to protect the data as it flows through. So what we're really focusing on today is the top agreement, the provider jurisdiction agreement, which is the legal piece that covers the transmission or the sharing of data from those provider organizations on the left with the IIS entities. Obviously, the data passes through IZ Gateway, but for pictures here, at least you get to see that the legal agreement is covers that exchange there. So I think we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so next slide. Yep. So the data use agreement with APHL. Again, that was the baseline agreement that's required for participation in all use cases. Its purpose is simply to facilitate exchange of immunization information through the IZ Gateway. The security provisions are captured with, by documenting the compliance with FSMA, HIPAA, FedRAMP. And then also the task order is where, sorry, my chat box is covering up what I'm trying to say. The task order is the appendix to that agreement, and that's where jurisdictions have chosen which use cases or project components that jurisdictions want to participate in. Next slide, please. Okay, and I see that there is, okay, yes, so let me see so now let's go ahead. I see there's a question in the chat and we will cover that in the Q&A session. So let's go ahead and do a deeper dive into this provider jurisdiction agreement. So first we're going to overview and then we're going to go into some of the key terms. So first, you should know that this was modeled after the interjurisdictional MOU that most, I think, well over 50 jurisdictions have already signed. And it was informed by reviewing 15 jurisdictions IIS related agreements. So in other words, we did a wide variety of state laws or state agreements were looked at to see how we could better inform and craft this agreement that was going to be impact potentially up to 64 different jurisdictions. And speaking of which, obviously the purpose of this overall was the intention is to create a multi-party agreement that would streamline the number of agreements that those provider organizations on the left of the visual we had up there, that they need to sign with the IISs on the right, because potentially each of those would need to sign 64 agreements. So the idea was to really create a multi-party agreement that relieves much of the administrative burden across the board for the parties, because realize for each one of those providers on the left, that each of them on the IIS side, you'd have to be signing agreements with each one of those federal departments or non-traditional vaccine providers. So the hope for this is that it really streamlines the process across the board for folks. We did solicit IIS review and received feedback on the draft agreement, which was helpful. We received helpful edits from several IISs, and that made for a better document. We also want to mention that the Veterans Health Administration has reviewed and approved the agreement already, as Michelle said at the head of the call. And there are 3 jurisdictions that have already signed on also. So it's happening, it's moving along, and people are pretty excited that this is moving. Our hope is that other federal agencies and provider organizations will also utilize this agreement, and it is set up to do exactly that. So we hope to have more to tell you about that soon, or the CDC does, I should say. Next, please. Okay, so now we're going to run through some of the key terms, some of which are boilerplate, some of which are just to let you know what you'll see when you're reviewing the document. So the parties to this agreement are the multi-jurisdictional vaccine providers and the actual jurisdictions, in other words, the IISs on the right side of the graphic. And the purpose, quite simply, is data exchange of immunization information through the IZ gateway, specifically immunization reporting and then immunization query, again, consistent with applicable law. Next, please. So note that it's clear, this does not prevent any other communications or agreements outside of IZ Gateway. It does not limit an IIS's rights to share its data with other entities or enter into other agreements for sharing their data. And applicable law, I'll just read it because it's clear on its face. All applicable statutes and regulations of the state or jurisdiction, including federally recognized tribal governments and U.S. territories in which the party operates, as well as all applicable federal statutes, regulations, standards, policy requirements. For federal entities, note that they are subject to applicable federal laws only. Next slide. So there are 2 types of data exchange that this agreement covers, and for purposes going through the IZ Gateway. One is the immunization reporting, those XVU messages that the provider that's giving the immunization information via IZ Gateway, giving that information over to a jurisdiction, reporting it out to the jurisdiction. And then there's the immunization query function, which is the QBP messaging, where consistent with applicable law, the provider queries one or more jurisdictions, again, via the IZ Gateway, and then those one or more jurisdictions provide the immunization information back to the querying provider. And as already mentioned earlier by Lindsey, there's the part of the agreement also documents that each party determines the information it will provide to another party. That's the jurisdictional choice there. Next slide, please. Okay, and so other key terms. So the immunization information is defined here as information created by those providers or created within or received by an IIS that relates to past, present, future immunization status. It also includes the provision of vaccines to an individual, and the definition includes medical or clinical information related to immunization. Note that there is an incorporation of data term, which the receiving party is allowed to, or incorporate the data into its own data system, into its own IIS, and then control, use, and disclosure of data. The data is subject to the receiving party's control, use, and disclosure, and the expectation, as documented, is responsible for the data protection itself. Next slide. So privacy and security, obviously a key term for this kind of data sharing. There are certain, by signing this, the party affirms the following: implementation of confidentiality policies, implementation of the appropriate administrative, physical, and technical safeguards to protect privacy and security, language that looks like HIPAA language. All reasonable efforts to implement industry standards for information security. We do want to note within the agreement that HIPAA is the floor for providers. I think I just noticed a spelling error there. Maybe not. And the federal agency providers must comply with applicable law. So there is another term also on breach notification, which is that upon discovery, the receiving party makes reasonable efforts to identify the source of the data received through the IZ gateway and notifies the sending party and administrator. Let's go ahead to key terms. So these are the more boilerplate terms: governing law, in the event of a dispute, applicable law, federal and state conflicts of laws provisions will determine the governing law. There are terms for withdrawal and termination. There's no monetary exchange. There's a clause on no warranties. It's just best efforts. There is no indemnification. The limitation of liability clause holds parties responsible for their own liability. And there is no fixed term in terms of the period of this agreement. And then you can refer up to the withdrawal and termination clauses for the details of how to terminate or withdraw from the agreement. So next one, please. Okay, so because this is not a traditional two-party agreement, there were certain responsibilities needed to be handled by an administrator. So the CDC is the administrator of this agreement, and certainly not all of their obligations or responsibilities are listed here, but some of the ones we wanted to point out are: the CDC will be maintaining signed copies from all signatories. The administrator will be maintaining contact information and is responsible for getting updates as needed or maintaining them as needed. They will be, the CDC or the administrator will be receiving and providing notice under the provider jurisdiction agreement. And again, because this is not a traditional two-party agreement, the administrator will be making accessible to the parties of the agreement a list of all of the parties to the agreement. And also the administrator plays the role of facilitating, addressing any questions or concerns. So I think, yes. Oh, and this is, I should mention that just like the, this administration role is just like with the MOUs that many of the jurisdictions have entered into already, which is administered by ARA, the American Immunization Registry Association. So this parallels that kind of legal structure. So with that, I think we now are ready to go into any questions that people have, and I will turn it back over to Michelle. Michelle?
Pardon me. Thank you so much, Chris and Lindsey, for your great presentations. Let's open it up for questions and answers. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the top or in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. There are many ways to ask your questions, and we look forward to hearing them. All right, somebody asked, Does anything change for IIS to IIS exchange? And I'm gonna take that one. The answer is no. Nothing changes for IIS to IIS data exchange. All of the technical and policy infrastructure in place for IIS to IIS exchange remains intact. Thank you for that question. All right, Monique Anawis asks, is permission sought from patients to enter their information, or is there an opt-out?
I can take that one.
Sure.
And I didn't get introduced, but I am Carrie Waggoner. I am also with the Network for Public Health Law and just attending today with Chris, and I also work on this project, so available for Q&A. So thank you, Monique, for your question. Whether or not permission is sought from patients would depend on the law that applies. So for example, if a provider who is administering an immunization and then looking to report that through the IZ gateway to the IIS, whether or not they need to obtain consent will depend on what the law in that particular jurisdiction requires. And that's kind of where that concept that Chris was talking about applicable law comes in. So if you do have to gain consent, that would be part of that process that the provider would have to go through before reporting the immunization data to the IIS through the IZ gateway.
Thank you, Carrie. Another question from Lisa. Very thorough presentation, thank you. I may have missed this, but by signing this agreement, might states violate its state HIPAA?
Carrie, I'm going to defer to you on that one.
Oh, I just lost the question.
Sorry.
It's okay. I think I just have to switch tabs.
So it falls under
So
applicable law. Right?
Yes, exactly. They should not violate any state confidentiality laws that apply, or if HIPAA applies to the party, there shouldn't be any violation of that, as Chris said, because of the application of applicable law. And really that is all state and federal laws and regulations that would apply to a particular party. So that's part of the assessment I think a party will have to go through, whether you're an IIS or a private provider or a federal agency. What are kinds of universe of laws that you comply with? And each party will kind of have to make that assessment under that concept of applicable law that we talked about.
Thank you. I hope that answers the question. Another question, is there a location which is going to have a list of all participants? The answer is yes. That is forthcoming, and we will publicize that location when it is available. Another question, if there is no change for the IIS to IIS exchange, do the currently signed agreements still, and are they still legally binding, or does this new one need to be completed in order for the data exchange to be covered under a DUA? I will defer that to Chris or Carrie.
So I can take that one as well. So I think what we got to do is go back to the concept of the use cases. So there are those three different agreements that Chris went over that jurisdictions will sign, for example. Yeah, going to that graphic might be helpful. Thank you, Michelle.
Are we looking at this one?
This one here is fine. Yep. So in order for a jurisdiction, an IIS, to engage in any data sharing through the IZ gateway, you have to sign that data use agreement with APHL. And through that, you being the jurisdiction, select which components or use cases you want to participate in. So there have been some circumstances where the task order where you select the components you want to participate in might need to be revised if you'd like to say add a new one. But that agreement would remain in place. It's between APHL and the jurisdiction. The provider jurisdiction agreement that you see at the top of the screen supports the use case for exchange from IIS to provider organizations, so federal agencies and the multi-jurisdictional providers that Chris talked about. We're on that right-hand side, and I'm circling, but Michelle, if you circle around the MOU, supports a different use case, that of exchange between IIS programs. And so that MOU and the APHL DUA remain in effect and legally binding, regardless of whether you choose to participate in the provider organization use case. I hope that answers your question. And if not, please let us know. We're happy to talk through that further.
Thank you. All right, another question is there a deadline for executing the PJA? Lindsey, would you like to take that question?
Sure, yeah. No, there is no technical deadline, but it is worth mentioning that this would affect the onboarding, so to speak, timeliness. So the sooner you get the provider jurisdiction agreement signed and returned to us, that will then signal that you are prepared and ready, and we can move on to the next steps with onboarding. And if that's delayed further, then onboarding will be delayed as well.
Thank you. Will these slides be available? And the answer is yes, the slides will be made available on NPHL's website along with the webinar recording. All right.
Michelle, do you want me to cover the question we get on
yes, through the chat?
Like the uses of the data and potential third-party access to data?
That would be great.
So that's a concern we hear from time to time, and we've heard with other use cases is, how do we know third parties will not have access to the data? So regarding the provider jurisdiction agreement, it supports two types of data exchange that Chris talked about, the immunization reporting or that VXU messaging, and the immunization query or the QBP between the provider organizations and the IIS. I want to point out that the purpose, again, is to facilitate the exchange of immunization data so that we have providers and IIS have complete immunization records. Like that's the purpose of the data sharing. So the PJA would not support additional or does not support additional uses of the data. And I'll point out the MOU and the DUA with APHL have similar provisions. Also within the provider jurisdiction agreement, there's a section that we didn't specifically go over in the deep dive today, but section 18 talks about contractors and vendors and that they must agree to substantially similar terms in the PJA. And particularly around privacy and security, the terms must be at least as stringent as the terms in the PJA.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for answering that question. Okay, another question is how might I get a copy of the PJA and the crosswalk of the PJA and the interjurisdictional MOU? If you would like a copy of the agreement and a crosswalk document that MPHL prepared and we sent out along with the PJA on January 14th, please contact izgateway@cdc.gov and we will be happy to share that with you. If it's easier for you to contact myself or Lindsey directly, you may do that as well. All right, another question. What if my state's immunization law restricts how we share data with providers? Carrie, are you able to take that one?
Sure. So we recognize there may be circumstances where, as jurisdictions review this, they have concerns about, whether when they're assessing applicable law, whether or not their state law will support sharing under this agreement. And that's something that I think our team is available to meet with jurisdictions and their attorneys to talk through and hear concerns and see if we can find a way to address that. But probably we'll do that on an individualized basis. So I think as we wrap up, there's a contact email there. And if you do have any of those sorts of questions or concerns, please reach out through that and we'll be in touch to discuss those concerns further.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Any other questions coming in from the attendees here? All right, let's take a moment to go through our next steps, and feel free to drop questions in as they come up while we're going through the next steps. So first is to please review and garner signature on the PAA that was sent to the IIS managers and immunization program managers on January 14th. You can ask specific questions or request individualized discussion by contacting us at izgateway@cdc.gov. There will be a brief 6-question survey that pops up when the webinar ends. And we do request that you complete that. It will really help us to improve the content. You can share with your colleagues that there are upcoming webinars so this is today, and then there's one a week, every week through February 18th. So you can find the registration information for the webinars in the IIS info brief or by going to NPHL's website. All right, are there any other questions from attendees on the line? Or was this content so crystal clear that you're ready to go back and get moving? Hopefully it's the latter. Or maybe it's a Friday afternoon. Okay, well, thank you all so much for attending and being active participants. We really appreciate your active participation and willingness to engage with us on this topic. We are very excited for this agreement and the data exchange with the federal agencies and other multi-jurisdictional vaccine providers that it enables, and we hope you are too. So have a great Friday and have a wonderful weekend. Bye, everybody.